Establishing central dominion and opening lines for bishops sets the stage for an active queenside initiative. Developing the knight to f6 is a flexible and common way to meet white's central pawn advance, keeping options open for various pawn structures. Instantly claiming central space, c moves a pawn to challenge black's knight and prepare for queenside expansion. Embracing the fianchetto, black sets the stage for a powerful bishop on the long diagonal, creating immediate counterplay. Developing the knight to c3 solidifies the center and prepares for potential kingside castling, maintaining a flexible pawn structure. Developing the bishop to its long diagonal immediately contests the center and prepares kingside castling. Emboldened central pawn thrust, asserting dominance and opening lines for bishop and queen. Solidifying the center and preparing for king's pawn thrust e5, this choice creates central tension. Solidifying the center's grip and preparing kingside castling. White gently fortifies their pawn structure while keeping lines flexible, securing the king's safety at last. This castling immediately addresses king's vulnerability and opens avenues for piece development. Developing the bishop to g5 immediately challenges the knight on f6. A common theme in this King's Indian setup, potentially forcing a decision about its future location and creating interesting imbalances in the center. Redirecting the knight to the queenside, a maneuver often seen in fianchetto structures, aims to challenge white's central pawn advance and potentially prepare a queenside expansion. This subtle repositioning seeks to avoid immediate central contact while simultaneously developing a piece to a less predictable square, setting the stage for queenside pressure and a fight for space. White redirects the queen to a more active diagonal, aiming to support a potential kingside pawn storm or prepare for kingside castling. This also clears the path for the rook on h1 to potentially join the attack later. Challenging the center immediately after castling forces a reckoning, potentially opening lines for piece activity sooner than expected and disrupting white's planned queenside expansion. Bolstering the pawn center creates a formidable barrier, limiting black's knight on a6 and immediately dictating where the play will likely unfold. This knight repositions to a more active square, eyeing the queenside and potentially preparing to challenge white's central pawn chain with a circa 5 advance, while also offering a defensive shield for the king. Solidifying the pawn chain, white opts for a conservative approach, aiming to deny black's knight a foothold on c5 and prepare for a potential kingside advance. This move also opens the f3 square for potential piece maneuvering, though it does create a slight weakness on the dark squares around the king. Black must now consider how to challenge white's central control, perhaps by actively engaging the d5 pawn or seeking counterplay on the queenside. Unlocking the queenside, black aims to seize open lines and potentially create a passed pawn, though it does weaken the b5 square and allows white control of the d5 outpost. The bishop retreats to d1, a seemingly passive choice, but it strategically clears the c3 square for a knight, preparing for potential central expansion or a regrouping of forces. And importantly, it protects the crucial e4 pawn from any immediate threats. This maneuver aims to bolster white's defensive structure while subtly probing for black's weaknesses, anticipating a dynamic struggle in the center. Black bravely injects immediate counterplay, aiming to dismantle white's central pawn barricade and liberate the knight on circa 5. This bold maneuver immediately challenges white's pawn chain and creates dynamic imbalances, forcing a strategic reckoning. Developing the other knight opens up avenues for kingside castling and solidifies the center, preventing black's potential queenside expansion from becoming too potent. Notice how the nc3 is now free to participate in central action or reinforce the d5 pawn if needed. The pawn structure just fractured, opening the c-file and potentially creating future infiltration routes for black's rook. This exchange concedes central space to white but aims to activate the knight on c5 and potentially pressure white's queen on d2. Black is opting for a more dynamic game, accepting an unbalanced position in exchange for counterplay. Unlocking the c-file immediately after black's pawn grab intensifies the positional battle, creating immediate tension and demanding a precise response from black regarding piece development and control of the central squares. Black's queenside expansion is intended to disrupt white's harmony and potentially create weaknesses on the c3 square. However, it also commits the pawn to an advanced position where it could become a target or impede the mobility of black's own pieces. This pawn thrust creates immediate tactical questions regarding its support and the long-term strategic implications of such a bold advance on the edge of the board. Repositioning the bishop from the active diagonal to c2 aims to secure it from further harassment by black's advanced pawns and prepares for potential pawn pushes on the kingside, while also clearing the way for the rook to potentially join the action on the d-file. Unleashing the queen to a broad diagonal. This maneuver aims to exploit the long-range potential created by white's doubled pawns on the d-file and the open a-file, while simultaneously eyeing potential targets on the kingside or a tempo gain against the pinned bishop. White retreats the knight to b1, a curious defensive maneuver that seems to surrender central space but aims to regroup and reinforce the queenside, possibly to prepare a later advance of the b-pawn or to redeploy the knight to c3 or even d2 to support the kingside. This positional sidestep, while appearing passive, might be a subtle attempt to lull black into a false sense of security about control of the queenside, allowing white to build up pressure elsewhere. Shifting the queen to b6 accomplishes a dual purpose. It offers a more active central outpost for the queen, potentially eyeing the d4 pawn, and it also prepares for a potential regrouping of the knight from c5, possibly to a more menacing square if the opportunity arises. Reclaiming that knight's central influence, white aims to establish a more active presence on the queenside, potentially supporting a pawn push or preparing for piece exchanges that might open lines. Developing the bishop to d7 elegantly connects the rooks and prepares for potential operations on the queenside, while also offering a subtle pawn shield for the king if needed. Initiating pressure on the queenside wing. The rook ventures to the b-file, a bold declaration of intent that challenges black's territorial ambitions and hints at potential breakthroughs if black isn't vigilant. Rethinking piece deployment. Black aims to activate the rook along the open c-file, challenging white's control and preparing potential pressure against the c3 knight or even further down the rank. Developing the bishop to a more active square allows it to eye the queenside and potentially support a future kingside push. Embarking on a bold excursion to the kingside flank, the knight ignites a strategic firestorm, aiming to disrupt white's nascent queenside pawn structure and potentially create weaknesses around the king. Targeting the kingside pawn structure, white initiates a pawn break with g3 to reinforce the beleaguered f3 pawn and prepare for potential kingside expansion, simultaneously creating a safe haven for the bishop on g2. Unleashing a bold central pawn push, black dramatically challenges white's carefully constructed pawn chain, seeking to shatter its defensive integrity and open avenues for counterplay, particularly aiming at the now exposed kingside. Embracing the opportunity to disrupt black's pawn structure, this capture initiates a dynamic sequence. opening the F file for potential piece activity and creating immediate tactical lines. Embracing the open lines, Black reconstructs their pawn structure, inviting immediate counterplay along the now exposed kingside. This castle aims to secure the king and prepare for potential pawn storms on the kingside, while also freeing the G file for future piece activity if Black continues with aggressive pawn pushes. The knight's sortie to f6, after its previous adventures on the queenside, seems to be a reactive measure, aiming to shore up the king's defenses. However, this repositioning does little to challenge White's accumulating central influence in the looming pressure on the queenside where Black's pawns are already quite advanced. It's a move that prioritizes immediate safety over proactive play, potentially allowing White to solidify their positional advantage and prepare further breakthroughs. Unlocking the queenside with that knight reroute creates intriguing possibilities for immediate action. This knight's journey to c3 subtly prepares to reinforce the d5 pawn, a crucial strongpoint controlling central squares, while simultaneously repositioning to potentially support an assault on Black's queenside weaknesses. It hints at a positional squeeze, aiming to gradually constrict Black's development and space. The subtle shift in the knight's influence might also be preparing for a later advance of the b-pawn, leveraging the protected queenside to generate its own counterplay. White is demonstrating patience, building a solid foundation before committing to more dynamic operations. Black's queen now eyes the queenside pawn mass, preparing to unravel the tangled queenside and potentially exploit the weakened light squares around White's king. Bringing the rook to the second rank fortifies the kingside and prepares for potential queenside pressure, aiming to connect the rooks and develop a more active central presence. Shifting the king to h8 is a prudent defensive maneuver, vacating the vulnerable g8 square and preparing for potential pawn advances on the kingside or a flight path should the queenside become untenable, though it does little to alleviate Black's cramped position and offers White the chance to centralize their pieces further. Unlocking the b5 square is the immediate objective here, aiming to create a strong outpost for the knight and potentially disrupt Black's queenside structure. This maneuver is designed to exert pressure on Black's c6 pawn and simultaneously prepare for a potential knight transfer to d6 or even c4 if the opportunity arises, creating a pincer on White's central pawns. Observe how the placement on b5 could limit the activity of Black's pieces, especially the queen, and potentially force a pawn commitment that weakens the dark squares around Black's king. A bold exchange, simplifying the position by removing Black's most active queen, though it relinquishes the central tension White had meticulously built, potentially offering Black breathing room and a clearer path to activate their pieces. Liberating the rook from its defensive post on the first rank allows it to rejoin the fray, aiming to contest the crucial d-file which has become a contested highway after the recent exchanges. The rook's redeployment to the third rank offers a fascinating counterpoint to White's potentially vulnerable kingside, preparing to exert influence over the open c-file and even the eventual d-file, while simultaneously fortifying the queenside pawns and potentially seeking active squares for the rooks in the upcoming endgame. Anchoring the queenside by establishing a strong presence on the c-file immediately addresses the queenside pawn structure and prepares for potential pawn storms. Unleashing the pawn storm on the queenside, Black injects a jolt of dynamic energy, aiming to fracture White's pawn structure and create dynamic counterplay. Relocating the bishop to this diagonal now aims to bolster the kingside pawn structure and prepare for a potential knight sortie to the c4 square, creating a more cohesive defensive formation against black's aggressive queenside expansion and central pawn push. The rook slides into the heart of the action, aiming to wrestle control of the open d-file and potentially stir up complications on the queenside, where white's pieces are somewhat awkwardly placed. A daring thrust into the enemy's position, aiming to disrupt black's pawn chain and create attacking possibilities on the queenside. The knight suddenly jumps into the fray, creating a fascinating outpost and threatening a tactical explosion around the white queen and king. Considering the rook's repositioning to the queenside, white aims to shore up the queenside defenses against black's encroaching knights and pawns, potentially eyeing future rook activity on the b-file or a regrouping maneuver. Black's decision to immediately challenge the rook on c1 with rc8 is a bold attempt to exploit white's slightly passive piece placement and seize an open file, aiming to disrupt white's intended queenside expansion. Sacrificing the knight to disrupt black's queenside initiative and open lines offers white a dynamic advantage, potentially leading to a swift attack on the exposed king. A bold recapture, sacrificing central influence for a tangible piece advantage and disrupting white's queenside coordination, opening up possibilities on the now unprotected queenside and potentially threatening the isolated rook on the 7th rank. This bishop retreat aims to re-establish a more robust defensive structure on the queenside, seeking to alleviate the pressure along the c-file and prevent black from consolidating their advanced pieces in this sector. White hopes to eventually redeploy this piece to a more active square once the immediate tactical threats subside, perhaps on the g3-b8 diagonal or even supporting a kingside initiative later. Unveiling a pawn structure that invites potential weakness on the kingside. This capture sacrifices immediate pawn plurality for a freer development of black's remaining pieces. The knight's repositioning to c2 aims to stabilize the queenside and prepare for potential pawn advances, while simultaneously defending the b4 square, which is now exposed by the recent capture. Prioritizing king's safety amidst the unfolding tactical skirmish, Kilogram 8 subtly shifts the monarch away from the open d-file, anticipating any potential piece incursions that might arise from white's centralized knight and bishop. The knight retreats, seeking a more active post, anticipating the potential clearing of the d-file and eyeing the vulnerable black pawn structure. Gaining valuable outpost space for the bishop on b5 aims to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially support a future advance of black's queenside pawns. Unveiling a latent threat, the bishop tucks away, reinforcing the central pawn structure and preparing for potential pawn pushes or piece maneuvering on the queenside, opening a vital diagonal for the dark squared bishop and disrupting white's queenside pawn structure. Clearing the tension, white decides to simplify the position by exchanging the bishop for the knight, aiming to achieve a cleaner, less complex middle game and potentially exploit the isolated queenside pawns after the pawn structure solidifies. The knight's daring dive into the heart of white's queenside forces an immediate reckoning, challenging the positional integrity of the pawn structure and aiming to disrupt white's delicate balance. The bishop's return to e3 aims to bolster the e-pawn's advance, potentially creating a passed pawn if black isn't careful, while also preparing to contest the open d-file. Unleashing a central pawn offers fresh attacking avenues and aims to disrupt white's piece harmony, injecting dynamism into a previously somewhat static position. The knight's relocation to c2 aims to redeploy to a more active square, likely b4 or d4, potentially disrupting black's bishop pair advantage and preparing for a pawn push that might open lines. Injecting immediate activity, the knight surges forward, seeking to disrupt white's suddenly cramped queenside and potentially exploit the open d-file that now beckons. The knight's repositioning to the center creates a dynamic tension, seeking to exploit the open lines and potential weaknesses in black's pawn structure. Embracing the opportunity to consolidate, black repositions the bishop, preparing to challenge white's central pawn majority and potentially unleash pressure along the weakened queenside structure. Bringing the rook to the first rank is a strategic regrouping to potentially defend the e-pawn and prepare for a later advance on the kingside, or perhaps to contest the open d-file if black's bishop repositions. Unleashing the knight's power onto the weakened c4 square, black creates a dynamic tension, threatening to disrupt white's central structure and potentially opening new avenues for attack. With the bishop pair seizing the initiative with a knight sacrifice, white aims to shatter black's queenside pawn structure and create immediate tactical complications. Striking the knight on d2 removes a key defender and opens up the passed d-pawn, a critical element for black's endgame prospects. Recapturing the bishop solidifies white's pawn structure, creating a fortress on the queenside while preparing to activate the rook on the open c-file. Reactivating the rook to the second rank immediately contests the open file, aiming to penetrate white's defenses and exploit the weakened pawn structure around the king, while simultaneously offering a tactical dance with the knight on c2. Activating the bishop to threaten the now exposed d3 pawn and reinforce the kingside defense opens up potential tactical skirmishes on the central ranks. Sensing an opportunity to disrupt white's coordination, black sacrifices the bishop for 2 pawns, aiming to create dynamic complications and exploit the suddenly exposed white king. The pawn grab at *fxe4** initiates a dangerous pawn race in a position already riddled with tactical complexities, potentially exposing the white king's sanctuary to the centralized black bishop and knight. The bishop sacrifices itself, opening a surprising pathway for the rook to penetrate the queen's defense and potentially trap it on the c-file. Pushing the rook to the center of the action opens up the d-file, aiming to exploit the exposed black king and potentially create mating threats, while simultaneously reinforcing white's pawn structure after the recent exchanges. Sacrificing the bishop to disrupt white's pawn structure and activate the knight creates an immediate positional imbalance, forcing white to contend with an isolated doubled pawn on the d-file.